Hey guys, what's up? So today we're going to talk about hieroglyphics. So just like in the opener of the lesson, we talked about how people are always looking for an easier way to communicate with one another. Whether, like we talked about, whether it's slang or ebonics or talking through emojis, people always are looking to say the same thing, but just quicker and easier ways to do it. And that was no different when it was back in the times of the ancient Egyptians. So what exactly were hieroglyphics? Well, hieroglyphics are characters in a system of writing in which symbols represent objects like tools, animals, boats, but also ideas such as motion, time, joy, things like that. The ancient Greeks were actually the first people to use the term hieroglyph, which meant sacred carving, and they used this to describe decorative characters carved on Egyptian monuments. But the term now mostly is used to talk about systems of writing used by the Egyptians. And there's about 700 to 800 characteristics that make up the whole Egyptian hieroglyphic alphabet. So this is what it looks like. As you can see, each letter has its own symbol, whether it be an animal or something else. But each one of these symbols represents something that is important to the Egyptian civilization. So I want you to think, why would each one of those things be important for the civilizations of Egypt? So since they have this kind of crazy way of communicating with one another to describe not just, objects, but also sounds, how do they use it? So the word hieroglyphic literally translates to language of the gods. So it symbolizes how important these were. So priests use hieroglyphics to write down prayers and magic texts that related to life after death when it came to worshiping the gods. So things with the afterlife, like we talked about when we talked about mummies in the previous days. Other things were when they would prepare tombs, people would write stories about themselves through hieroglyphics to guide themselves to the afterworld. And they would also write on tombs and inside of the coffins. So as you can see, whether it's this picture of the tomb or the last one, people want to tell a story about themselves, of how great and clean a life that they lived, so that they can move on to the afterlife and achieve that immortality that we talked about. Other things that hieroglyphics were used for, not just for religious reasons, but also for everyday life. People used hieroglyphics to document important meetings and conversations within the government so everything could run smoothly. And they would also use it for math purposes, whether it was to talk about trading, how much grain or cattle did somebody owe for a certain transaction? How did the water levels of the Nile change, and how would that affect how they were going to farm for the upcoming years? So it wasn't just for religious purposes, but just overall, people in different areas of life used hieroglyphics to communicate with each other and also just to share ideas. Other things that they would also use is not just for talking, but also they would carve symbols into stone or wood, and they would put them in gold or silver and other metal. And they also would paint hieroglyphics on different surfaces, sometimes putting, simple figures in different colors of ink, or other times using various bright colors and details. So you might think these just look like a bunch of squiggly lines that a 2-year-old wrote. How in the heck can people figure out what these are saying? So what happened was they found something called a Rosetta Stone, or the Rosetta Stone, excuse me. So what exactly was the Rosetta Stone? So the Rosetta Stone was a stone that was found in ancient Egypt in the late 1700s when a man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte and his army came from France to conquer Egypt. So when they were there, his soldiers found this stone and they realized the importance of it. So what they did was they realized that on a certain section of the stone, it was written in Greek, which was a language they could still understand. So what they did was they took it back to France with them to try to kind of figure it out and figured out what it said. But it wasn't until many, many years later that they actually did. Who the person was that figured this out was a man by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion, who he was able to figure out the kind of combinations between Greek and French writing. So because of that, then he could kind of figure out what it was that the ancient Egyptians were talking about. So if it weren't for him, people even today wouldn't be able to figure out, how the Egyptians lived, what was important to them, and, most importantly, what it is that they left behind. So overall, as a summary, and the things that I really want you to focus on with hieroglyphics is hieroglyphics themselves were picture symbols that represented objects but also sound. Hieroglyphics were also used in all parts of Egyptian society. As I mentioned before, they were used in religious ceremonies to kind of talk about how people were going to the afterlife, for them to kind of plead their case as to why they lived a good life and to do everything that they could to reach immortality and reach that afterlife. And also, people many thousands of years later were able to discover a stone that allowed them to translate hieroglyphics into a language that people in modern civilizations could understand. And because of that, historians today can look at what was important to the Egyptians, how they lived, and what they left behind. All right, guys, that's all I got for hieroglyphics. So we will wrap up this lesson together then. Deuces.